Good afternoon. Today we're going to discuss research design and qualitative research. So, research design is a set of decisions that make up the master plan that specifies the approach for collecting and analyzing the needed information. So basic marketing research designs can be successfully matched to the given problems they are designed to solve. And they serve like a blueprint that can be used to build the survey, the research that's necessary, the analysis that's going to be done on it, as well as the end report, the outline of the report. So a prominent member of the marketing research community lets us understand the importance of design this way. Knowing which research design is needed to solve a client's problem can predetermine certain procedures that will likely be needed. This leads to efficient research planning and also advising the client early on as to the approach we're taking and the advantages and disadvantages of that approach. So there's three types of research design: exploratory, descriptive, and causal. So for research design, there's a few cautions. First, exploratory, descriptive, and causal are not necessarily carried out in that order. They can be carried out in any order. Certain things can be repeated as you go through the process. Second, this is an iterative process. It's not you go through once and everything's copacetic. This is iterative. You have to go through it several times. Often you'll have to go through it several times. And we learn that we may need additional research every time we go through. And so that may result in multiple research designs as we keep changing, as we learn more. And third, it makes sense to first conduct exploratory research, then descriptive, and finally causative, although it's not mandatory they be done in exactly that order. It usually is a good idea to consider it. So here's some of the objectives. With exploratory, we want to gain background information, understand the vocabulary, clarify the problems and hypotheses. For descriptive, we're going to describe the marketing phenomenon, and causal, we're going to make if-then statements with causal. So exploratory research is most commonly unstructured, informal research that is undertaken to gain background information about the general nature of the research problem. Exploratory research can be accomplished by simply reading a magazine or even observing a situation. So oftentimes research is done by just sales people who are observing patterns in their sales. And so that's why we So McDonald's was founded by Ray Kroc, who noticed that he was selling a lot more milkshake machines to this small franchise in California by the McDonald's brothers. And that led to, of course, one of the most successful fast food chains in history, McDonald's. So some of the uses of exploratory research: gain background information, define the terms, clarify the problems and hypotheses, establish research priorities. Some of the commonly used methods for conducting exploratory research are secondary data analysis, experience surveys, case studies, and other methods of qualitative research. Case study is when you have an in-depth interview with one or a very small number of individuals who are, you presume, are having the ability to give you some insight into what is happening. So descriptive research answers questions of who, what, where, when, and how. For example, what brands do people like? What quantities? When do they shop? How they found out about our products? So this is descriptive research. Descriptive research is desirable when we wish to project a study's findings to a larger population. If a study sample is representative, the findings may be used to predict some variables of interest, such as sales. Cross-sectional studies measure units from a sample at only one point in time. So sample surveys are cross-sectional studies whose samples are drawn in such a way to be representative of the specific population, but it's only at one point in time. In contrast, longitudinal studies repeatedly measure the same sample units of a population over time. Longitudinal studies often make use of a panel which represents sample units who have agreed to answer questions at periodic intervals. Many large research firms maintain panels of consumers. Continuous panels are when you ask panel members the same questions on each panel member, measurement. Discontinuous panels vary questions from one panel measurement to the next and are often referred to as omnibus panels. Omnibus means including or covering many things or classes. These panels may be used for a variety of purposes, and the information collected by a discontinuous panel varies from one panel measurement to the next. So if you remember, Ipsos was one of the marketing research firms that we gave a report on last week. And one of their specialties is panels. Continuous panels are used quite differently from discontinuous panels in that one may use data from continuous panels to gain insights into changes in consumers' purchases, attitudes, and so on. So, for example, brand switching studies are used to illustrate how consumers change brands, and marketing tracking studies track some variables of interest over time. Causality may be thought of as understanding a problem in terms of an if-then relationship. If something happens, then something else will happen. Causal relationships are determined by the use of experiments, which are special types of studies. So we use experiments to validate or to conduct causal research. And an experiment is defined as manipulating an independent variable to see how it affects a dependent variable. At the same time, we have to control the effects of extraneous variables. So an independent variable is a variable which the researcher has control over and wishes to manipulate. Some examples include level of advertising expenditure, type of advertising appeal, display location, price, type of product. So these are independent variables. Dependent variables are those that we have little or no direct control over, but we want to measure. So we have a strong interest in them and we want to measure them to see how a change in an independent variable causes a change in the measure of a dependent variable. So some examples of dependent variables might be sales or customer satisfaction or market share. So we might look at how does the measurement of sales change when we increase advertising? Advertising being the independent variable, sales being the dependent variable. And extraneous variables are those that you have some effect on the dependent variable, but they're not something you can control. So an example of a variable in which you have a strong interest, but you cannot directly control, is your GPA. So what independent variables over which you can control can affect a change in your GPA? Well, attending class, paying attention or being engaged in class, reading the book with interest, devoting adequate study time prior to taking a test. But again, extraneous variables are not as related to each other as the dependent and independent. Those are the variables that there may be some effect on the dependent variable, but they're not completely independent. So experimental design, that's where we want to form our experiment such that a change in a dependent variable may be attributed solely to a change in the independent variable. So that means we have to control for the effects on a dependent variable by an extraneous variable. And often you'll see some of the symbols for experimental design. We won't dig too deeply into these, but just for your information, O is the measurement of a dependent variable. X is the manipulation or change of an independent variable. R is a random assignment of subjects to experimental and control groups. And E is the experimental effect. So pretest is when we take a measurement of the dependent variable prior to changing the independent variable. Post-test refers to measuring the dependent variable after changing the independent variable. So a true experiment is one that isolates the effects of the independent variable on the dependent variable. Designs that do not properly control for the effects of the extraneous variable are known as quasi-experimental designs. A control group is a group of subjects who have not been exposed to a change in the independent variable. An experimental group is a group that has been exposed to a change in the independent variable. The before and after with control group design can be achieved by randomly dividing subjects of the experiment into two groups. the control group, and you don't apply the independent variable to them, and the experimental group. Test marketing is the phrase that's used to indicate an experiment, study, or test that's conducted in a field setting. So you might use it to test sales potential, or to look for the effects of varying your marketing mix for a product or service. There's several types of test markets, standard test markets, one in which the tests are done so that the firm tests the product or marketing mix variables through the company's normal distribution channels. Controlled test markets are conducted by outside research firms, and they guarantee distribution of the product through pre-specified types and numbers of distributors. Electronic test markets are those in which a panel of consumers has agreed to carry identification cards, and that each consumer presents those when buying goods and services. These tests are conducted only in a small number of cities in which local retailers have agreed to participate. The advantage of the card is that as the consumers buy or do not buy the test product, demographic information on the consumer is automatically collected. Simulated test markets are those in which a limited amount of data on consumer response to a new product is fed into a model containing certain assumptions regarding marketing programs, and that model will generate a probable product sales volume. So there's 3 criteria for test market city selection. Does the city represent the desired geographical area? Is the city isolated? So we don't want a spillover effect of the promotion into areas that are not in the test market. And finally, the ability to control distribution and promotion. So some of the advantages of test marketing: allows for the most accurate method of forecasting future sales, allows firms the opportunity to pre-test marketing mix variables. Some of the disadvantages are test markets don't yield infallible results. Sometimes your competitors will intentionally try to sabotage test results. They're expensive, and test markets bring about exposure of your new product ideas or approaches to the competition. So let's consider 2 broad approaches to marketing research. The first is qualitative, and the second is quantitative. So quantitative research uses structured questions in which response options have been predetermined and numerous respondents are involved. You can use a lot of statistical methods on quantitative research. Qualitative research involves analyzing the collected data and interpreting that data by observing what people do and say. So it's not going to be nearly as broad a net. You're going to focus in on a few people that you believe can provide insights into a certain phenomenon. You'll determine the questions you need to ask them. You'll interview them. You'll then interpret their responses to your questions. And you can gain insights into the market by doing this. So qualitative research is another type of marketing research. Pluralistic research is the combination of qualitative and quantitative methods. So you'll use both statistical methods as well as interview methods in what you're doing. So another type of qualitative research, in addition to interviews, is an observation, and that's where the market researcher observes what's going on rather than communicating with a person in order to obtain the information. So there's several different ways of organizing your observation. Direct observation is observing the behavior as it occurs. Indirect observation, the researcher observes the results of the behavior rather than the behavior itself. So this could be based upon archives, historical records, secondary data representing historical records or physical traces, and tangible evidence of some past event. A disguised observation, the subject is unaware of being observed. For example, mystery shoppers used by a retail store chain to record and report on the sales clerk's assistance and courtesy. Undisguised observation, respondents are aware of being observed when they go through it. Focus groups are small groups of people that are guided by a moderator, and they are dealing with unstructured, qualitative type interviews. And the idea is spontaneous discussion among the panel members is going to reveal information that's relevant to the research problem. So there's two types of focus groups, a traditional focus group and a non-traditional focus group. So a focus group has a facilities, and this is going to be a set of rooms that are especially designed for focus groups. The focus group is conducted in a room that seats about 10 people, along with a moderator. One wall is a large one-way mirror that allows clients in the adjoining room to watch the focus group. Some of the advantages of focus groups are, of course, they generate new ideas. They allow clients to observe their panel members who represent their consumers. You can look at understanding a wide variety of issues, and they're a fairly easy way to respond. Some of the disadvantages, they may not constitute representative samples. They're going to be too small, really, to be a representative sample, even if they were randomly selected. And usually they're not, because they're going to be people who are going to be paid to be there. So they're not going to have other job responsibilities that would preclude them. So there's an issue, are they really representative? So also, sometimes it's difficult to interpret the results. You have to have a real good interview technique in order to get results that you can interpret. And the cost is going to be relatively high. So focus groups should be used when the objective is to describe rather than predict. How would consumers describe a better package, their satisfaction with the service, or their response to an ad campaign? Focus groups should not be used when the research objective is to predict. Focus groups are based on a small number of respondents, and they're not representative of the larger population. Focus groups should not be used if research is going to dictate a major, expensive decision for the company. Another type of qualitative research is in-depth interviews. This is a one-on-one interview where you ask probing questions to get at what the subject thinks about something like your product and why the subject behaves certain ways with respect, in this case, to your product. And laddering is a technique that's used in interviews to discover how product attributes are associated with desired consumer values. And it comes from the notion that the researcher is trying to establish the linkages or steps leading from product value attributes to values. Protocol analysis involves a decision-making situation and then asking the subject to verbalize everything they're considering when making a decision. And another qualitative research technique is the projective technique, and that's where participants are placed into a model or simulated activity, and the expectation is that they will divulge things about themselves that they might not reveal under direct questioning. And another approach like that is the word association test. And the researcher is looking for hidden meanings or associations between responses and the words being tested. Another qualitative research approach is sentence completion. Respondents are given incomplete sentences and asked to complete them in their own words. And the researcher then analyzes the completed parts to identify themes or concepts that exist among the different responses. Another qualitative research approach is the cartoon or balloon approach. You have an empty balloon above the head of one of the actors, and our subjects are asked to write in the balloon. The researcher then inspects these thoughts to find out how subjects feel about the situation described in the cartoon. Another qualitative approach is role-playing. Participants are asked to pretend they're a third person and describe how they would act in a certain situations. So the researcher can spot latent reactions, positive or negative, conjured up by the situation. And then we have ethnographic research. That's where we look at a detailed descriptive study of a group and its behavior, characteristics, and culture. Ethnographers pay close attention to words, metaphors, symbols, and stories people use to explain their lives and communicate with one another. Obviously, ethnographic research is an area of ethical sensitivity. Okay, any questions on chapter 4? Okay,